April 14, 1865. Ford's Theater, Washington, D.C. The audience is laughing at the comedy playing out on stage. But behind the curtain, in the shadows, a man is waiting. His footsteps are quiet, his purpose lethal. Then laughter freezes into silence with a single gunshot. The man disappears into the night, and the leader who kept the country together takes his final breath. Abraham Lincoln, 16th President of the United States, lies lifeless. The man who ended slavery, but the man who led a splintered nation through its civil war. The man who began his life in a small log cabin, lacking wealth, lacking connections, lacking formal education. His rise from humble beginnings to the great emancipator is a story of struggle, perseverance, and triumph. But how did this common boy born on the frontier end up one of the most revered leaders in American history? How did he rise from poverty, political defeat, and personal tragedy to save the Union and forever change the course of history? This is the story of Abraham Lincoln, the leader who held a nation together and brought hope to millions. To comprehend Lincoln's extraordinary journey, we have to go back to the wilds of Kentucky, where a young boy's story started. Abraham Lincoln was born February 12, 1809 in a one-room log cabin in Hardin County, Kentucky, currently called LaRue County. His father, Thomas Lincoln, was a hard-working but unsuccessful farmer. His mother, Nancy Hanks Lincoln, was a gentle, loving woman who tried to instill in the young Abraham a sense of kindness and honesty. Life on the frontier was tough. There were no luxuries, no comforts. The Lincolns subsisted on the land, growing their own food, erecting their own shelter, and risking the perils of the wilderness. Abraham's childhood was packed with hard work, chopping wood, hauling water, and taking care of crops. But even in such difficult circumstances, there was something special about young Abraham. And unlike the other children around him, Abraham wove many threads through the fabric of his being, feeding both piqued curiosity and an expansive love of learning. Books were scarce in the wilds, but Lincoln searched for learning wherever he could find it. He checked out books from neighbors who lived miles away, reading late into the night by the dim light of the fireplace. Among the few books he prized were the Bible, Aesop's fables, and biographies of great leaders like George Washington. But then tragedy struck early in Lincoln's life. His mother had died of milk sickness when Earl was 9 years old, one of the common deadly illnesses of the day. Abraham was devastated. Her death left an indelible scar on his young heart, but it also compelled him to grow up fast. His father remarried to a kind woman named Sarah Bush Johnston, who became a loving stepmother and an encouragement for Abraham's education. The Lincolns settled in Indiana in 1816, looking for better opportunities. The relocation was tough, and life in Indiana would prove no different. But Abraham kept working hard in the day and educating himself at night. He once walked 20 miles simply to borrow a book. His thirst for knowledge was like none other, and his astute mind began to distinguish him from those surrounding him. Abraham grew taller and stockier as a teenager, eventually reaching 6 feet 4 inches, but his greatest asset was his mind. He built a reputation for honesty and fairness and would settle disputes among neighbors. They started referring to him as Honest Abe, a handle that would trail him through his life. But Lincoln's story was just starting. He'd come from humble beginnings that taught him resilience, but it would be his ambition that would carry him far beyond the fields of Indiana. The young boy who read borrowed books by candlelight was about to take the stage on which a far bigger audience would soon shape the future of the country. Growing up, Abraham Lincoln had experienced hardship and hard work by the time he reached his early 20s, but his ambition burned hotter than ever. The Lincolns moved again, hoping for better luck, this time, in 1830, to Illinois. Abraham, a young man now, set out on his own, intent on forging a better future. His early jobs were humble. He served as a store clerk in New Salem, where he won the locals' affection with his honesty and storytelling skills. But Lincoln was not satisfied with popularity alone. He had so much to give and share, but lacked the knowledge he needed to do so. He taught himself grammar and mathematics and later law, with no formal education. The first step Lincoln took in public life was to seek election to the Illinois state legislature in 1832. He lost, But that defeat did not deter him. He faced his mistakes and tried again. 2 years later, in 1834, he was elected to the legislature as a member of the Whig Party. And here Lincoln was beginning to forge his political ideology, particularly his belief in infrastructure, education, and economic development. Lincoln also began his legal path during this time. He borrowed law books, studied tirelessly, and passed the bar exam in 1836. Lincoln was an itinerant lawyer whose courtroom tours took him to counties all across Illinois, where he handled cases ranging from land disputes to criminal defense. He was one of the most respected lawyers in the state, known for his sharp mind, quick wit, and unwavering honesty. Lincoln married the wealthy and politically connected Mary Todd in 1842. Mary's ambition and intellect equaled Lincoln's, and in their way they made a partnership that would last through triumph and tragedy. Lincoln's law practice flourished, but politics beckoned once more. He was elected to the U.S. House of Representatives in 1846. Lincoln condemned the Mexican-American War, which he regarded as untenable, in Congress, and he took a firm stand against the extension of slavery to new territories. But he was unpopular in part because of his opposition to the war, and after a single term he returned to Illinois, caring for his law practice and a burgeoning family. Lincoln avoided national politics for a few years, but the burgeoning conflict over slavery would soon pull him back into the fray. Lincoln's political fire was rekindled by the passage of the Kansas-Nebraska Act in 1854, which gave states the right to choose themselves whether to allow slavery. He believed that slavery was a moral evil and that its spread endangered the very basis of the United States. In 1858, Lincoln ran against Stephen A. Douglas for the U.S. Senate. A series of debates raised Lincoln's national profile and displayed his eloquence, logical acumen, and moral clarity. While Lincoln lost the election, the Lincoln-Douglas debates thrust him into the national spotlight, establishing what would come next. Abraham Lincoln went from a self-taught lawyer to a rising political star, but his transition immediately to the podium with the nation so divided at the time was remarkable. But his greatest trials and his greatest victories were yet to come. The country was on the verge of being split apart, and Lincoln would soon learn he found himself at the heart of its defining moment. By the late 1850s, the United States was teetering over a precipice. The argument for and against slavery had grown heated and divided the country in North and South. With Lincoln lesser known as a politician, he became further drawn in the struggle. His strong conviction that slavery should not extend to new territories conflicted with Southern states willing to fight to preserve their way of life. In 1860, the newly formed Republican Party, which opposed the expansion of slavery, selected Lincoln as its presidential nominee. Lincoln was considered moderate, steadfast in his faith, yet open to reach common ground. His opponents, however, depicted him as a radical who endangered the Southern economy and culture. The election campaign was fraught. Lincoln did not actively campaign, instead relying on speeches, pamphlets, and debates to promote his vision. He talked about unity, democracy, and what the hope of a nation would be like when all men might be free. His words struck chords with many in the North, but they bred fear and anger in the South. Abraham Lincoln was elected 16th President of the United States on November 6, 1860. He won without winning a single Southern state. The message was clear. Southern leaders thought their way of life was at risk. Even before Lincoln took office, South Carolina seceded from the Union in December 1860. Mississippi followed within weeks, along with Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas. These states were the Confederate States of America, and their president was Jefferson Davis. Lincoln's responsibilities as he prepared for his inauguration weighed heavily on him, and the future of America rested on his shoulders. He was contending with a country ripping itself apart. In his inaugural address on March 4, 1861, Lincoln pleaded for unity, saying, "We are not enemies, but friends. We must not be enemies." But his words were no match for the tide of conflict. In April 1861, Confederate forces fired on Fort Sumter, the South Carolina fort, just outside the harbor of Charleston, beginning the Civil War. The Union, directed by Lincoln, had the difficult task of keeping the nation together, while the Confederacy fought for its independence. Lincoln's election had induced the greatest crisis in American history, and as the nation plunged into war, Lincoln's leadership would be tested as never before. A man from humble beginnings now held the responsibility to keep the Union intact, even as it threatened to shatter forever. When the Civil War broke out in April 1861, Abraham Lincoln was faced with an impossible challenge: to hold together a nation rent asunder by ideology, economics, and fear. Lincoln had not imagined being a war-torn country when he became president, but it was the reality he now stared down. The Union Army was larger and better equipped, but it had poor leadership in the early years of the war. Lincoln lacked formal military training and had to rely on his instincts and judgment. His early generation generals, such as George McClellan, were frequently too cautious and failed to capitalize on openings, dragging battles on for many months. One of Lincoln's great challenges was balancing political pressure from all sides. Radical Republicans encouraged him to act urgently to end slavery, while Democrats, particularly in the border states, called on him to focus on unity rather than abolition. Every decision Lincoln made was under scrutiny, denounced, and debated. In the opening days of the war, Lincoln's objective was saving the Union. But as the conflict wore on, his views began to change. He recognized that slavery lay at the center of the war, and that its abolition was necessary to both winning the war and achieving lasting peace. In the aftermath of the bloody Battle of Antietam in 1862, Lincoln sensed an opening. While the battle was a stalemate, it emboldened him to issue the Emancipation Proclamation, a declaration that all slaves in land of the Confederacy would thus be free as of January 1, 1863. This audacious move transformed the war. It was no longer a question of saving the Union. It was now a struggle for emancipation and human rights. The proclamation also had foreign implications. European powers, such as Britain and France, who had considered extending support to the Confederacy, were unsure. They found it politically and morally difficult to support a government fighting to preserve slavery. But Lincoln's challenges didn't stop with the proclamation. The war dragged on, with catastrophic battles like Gettysburg, Chancellorsville, and Vicksburg. Thousands of lives lost, and every casualty weighed on Lincoln. He met soldiers in hospitals, consoled bereaved families, and bore the crushing weight of leadership with quiet strength. As the war escalated, Lincoln's personal sorrow did as well. In 1862, he lost his beloved son, Willie, to typhoid fever. The death hit Lincoln hard as well, and, along with his wife, Mary Todd Lincoln, he never recovered from the tragedy. But Lincoln carried on, bolstered by his faith in the Union and the rightness of the cause. By 1863, the tide of war was starting to turn toward the Union. But the road to victory remained long, and Lincoln's leadership would be challenged again and again. His speeches, letters, and decisions forged during these fraught years helped create the legacy that would become his defining mantle, the Great Emancipator. By 1863, the Civil War had taken thousands of lives, and the nation was scarred and weary. But the resolve of Abraham Lincoln never wavered. His belief that the nation must be united and his moral aversion to slavery led him to one of the most consequential decisions in American history, the Emancipation Proclamation. It had been issued on January 1, 1863. The proclamation freed all slaves in the territories held by the Confederacy. Though it did not instantly liberate all slaves, it altered the purpose of the war. The struggle was no longer simply for the Union. It was a struggle for freedom. It also permitted African American soldiers to enlist with the Union Army. More than 180,000 black soldiers would go on to serve, adding fresh strength and resolve to the Union cause. Lincoln's decision was criticized on both sides: too extreme, too little, too late. But he would not recede, realizing that this was a step toward justice. In the summer of 1863, the war had a tipping point. The Battle of Gettysburg, from July 1st to July 3rd, was one of the bloodiest battles in American history. Over 50,000 soldiers were killed, wounded, or missing. The Union's win at Gettysburg was a turning point, but it came at an unfathomable price. 4 months later, on November 19, 1863, Lincoln visited Gettysburg to dedicate the battlefield as a cemetery. His speech was short, only 272 words. but has become one of history's most iconic speeches. Addressing a crowd, Lincoln began, "47 years ago our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal." In only a handful of minutes, Lincoln called the nation back to its founding principles, celebrated the fallen soldiers, and called for recommitment to freedom and democracy. He concluded with words that reverberate to this day: "That government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth." The Gettysburg Address distilled the spirit of the American experiment. It changed the war from a struggle of politics to a one of moral crusade and established Lincoln as a leader whose words could inspire hope even in the bleakest of circumstances. But Lincoln's trials were far from finished. As the war extended into its second year, he was beset, all at once, by political opponents, military failures, and personal loss. However, it was his steadfast leadership through these crucibles that would secure his legacy as the great emancipator. The man who not only saved the Union but transformed the very concept of liberty in America. By early 1865, the long and bloody Civil War was beginning to draw to a close. After 4 bloody years of battle, the Union Army, now under General Ulysses S. Grant, had driven the Confederate troops to the verge of collapse. Abraham Lincoln, tired but resolute, sensed that victory was within his grasp. But he also knew that the real struggle would start after the war, rebuilding a divided country. On April 9, 1865, Lee surrendered to Grant at Appomattox Courthouse, sealing the outcome of the Civil War. The war that had torn families apart, leveled cities, and killed more than 600,000 people was finally over. The Union was saved and slavery destroyed. Mormons broke the bonds of sectionalism on their path to America, and Lincoln's vision for one united America had triumphed. But Lincoln soon began thinking about the future. He believed in Reconstruction, of healing, of returning the Southern states to the Union with charity for all. He famously said, "With malice toward none, with charity for all, let us strive to finish the work we are in, to bind up the nation's wounds." But not everyone was willing to get on board with Lincoln's vision of peace. Many in the South considered him a tyrant, and resentment persisted long after the war ended. And one man in particular, John Wilkes Booth, viewed Lincoln as a man who threatened the South's future and way of life. On the night of April 14, 1865, only 5 days following Lee's surrender, Lincoln went to a play, Our American Cousin, at Ford's Theater in Washington, D.C. The mood was light, and Lincoln appeared to be more relaxed than he had in months. But laughter echoed through the theater and, finally, Booth, a famed actor and Confederate sympathizer, reached the president's private box. Shortly after 10:15 p.m., Booth pointed a small pistol at the back of Lincoln's head and fired the weapon. The president slumped forward, out cold. Booth jumped onto the stage and shouted, "Sic semper tyrannis, thus always to tyrants," and escaped into the night. Lincoln was taken across the street to a boarding house there. Doctors scrambled to revive him, but the bullet had caused too much destruction. Abraham Lincoln was pronounced dead at 7:22 a.m. on April 15, 1865. Secretary of War Edwin Stanton soberly proclaims, "Now he belongs to the ages." News of Lincoln's death reverberated around the country. Not for them was the mourning simply of a president lost, but of the leader who had guided them through their darkest hour. Throughout cities and towns nationwide, Black and white Americans expressed anguish for the man who had liberated the enslaved and saved the Union. Lincoln's remains traveled by train from Washington to Springfield, Illinois, to be buried. Along the way, tens of thousands of mourners lined the tracks to pay their final respects. The man who began life in a log cabin was revered as one of the greatest leaders the world had ever known. But Lincoln's murder didn't resolve a lot. How would the country rebuild in his absence? Who would take up his vision for unity and equality? His assassination was a tragedy that deprived America of its kindest leader at the moment it most needed him. Abraham Lincoln's life was taken too soon, but his legacy has lived on for generations. His dream for America, one of a united and free nation, would form the cornerstone upon which the nation reconstructed itself after the Civil War. But Lincoln's impact reaches well beyond the battlefield and the political stage. The abolition of slavery was the greatest achievement of Lincoln's presidency. His Emancipation Proclamation paved the way, yet it wasn't until 8 months after his death, when the 13th Amendment to the Constitution was ratified in December 1865, that slavery was permanently abolished in the United States. Lincoln's steadfastness to human dignity set the nation's moral compass. Lincoln's presidency established new standards of presidential authority amid the Civil War, too. His use of executive power, challenged but effective in saving the Union, created precedents that his successors would follow. He struggled along the narrow path between democracy and dictatorship, carefully but always with the survival of the country as his priority. But Lincoln's legacy isn't only political, it is intensely personal. For countless Americans, Lincoln represents hope, resilience, and the power of integrity. His story, from a log cabin to the White House, is the very definition of the American dream. He showed us that greatness could be earned, that honesty and hard work and tireless pursuit of justice could lead an ordinary man to achieve an extraordinary thing. Memorials to Lincoln have remained reminders of his lasting power. The colossal pillars and towering figure of the Lincoln Memorial in Washington, D.C., has come to embody freedom and unity. Its walls carry his words, and they inspire civil rights and equality movements the world over. The speeches and actions of Lincoln have inspired leaders around the world. Mahatma Gandhi, Nelson Mandela, and Martin Luther King Jr. used Lincoln as the gold standard of moral leadership and courage. King's iconic "I have a dream" moment, of course, echoed Lincoln's own statement from the Gettysburg Address. He hoped for a nation where all men are truly equal. Lincoln's presidency is still studied and admired, even today. His empathy and leadership in an unprecedented time of crisis, his ready willingness to make tough choices for the common good, and his abiding faith in democracy have made him a figure for all ages. But Lincoln's greatest legacy may well be the simple yet profound notion that a beleaguered house divided against itself can mend. His life is a tribute to the resilience of the American spirit and a testament to a brighter future. No matter how dark the present may look, Abraham Lincoln was not just a president. He epitomized hope, an advocate for freedom, and a leader whose legacy lives on in the United States. His rise from humble origins to the great emancipator has become one of the most extraordinary stories in the history, one that reminds us that regardless of the most improbable of circumstances, one person can change the world.